Have you ever wondered why anti racism should be everybody's business? Dana Brownlee, senior contributor at Forbes, will unpack this for us. You might also be wondering what this has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Simply, DEI must be done through an anti racist lens. This means we work to deconstruct traditional systems and structures of oppression and engage in sustainable and intentional cross cultural community and movement building while prioritizing creating opportunities for representation, participation, and inclusion among staff and or volunteers. We are excited to have you here today with us. This conversation is going to be quite instrumental. I am looking forward to you all meeting my guests and my co-host. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chats. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions as possible. This takes a great deal of effort to pull off, so I'm eternally grateful to all of my loyal guests. Every week, we come up with new content and look forward to you subscribing to our YouTube channel to keep up with us. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The link to purchase the book will be in the comments. And for a living, I help thought-provoking leaders and organizations implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking signature talks, workshops, and webinars. Join us as we continue to share the different spaces within DEI. Today we have Dana Brownlee and Sahar. Thank you, Sahar. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to allow you both to introduce yourselves in a unique way. Sahar?
Thank you, Rochelle, for that. So my name is Sahir Keel. I am a director of business development with Diversity Connects Us.
I am so glad to be here. Thank you so much, Rochelle and Sahar, for having me. So, my name is Dana Brownlee. I am a Forbes Career Senior Contributor. I'm also a LinkedIn Learning Instructor. Thank you. And I've been a corporate trainer for 20 years, and I provide training on a range of topics: project management, workplace, meeting facilitation, team collaboration, and workplace anti-racism. So I'm just really, really glad to be here.
We are so
Oh,
excited to have you.
it's wonderful to have you. Let's jump right in for our audience. I know everybody's really excited about this conversation. I received a lot of feedback on LinkedIn. Dana, if you can define what a non-racist and an anti-racist is.
Certainly. And I think it's such a great question. Thank you for that. I think it's a great question. And certainly, Kendi talked about this. Dr. Kendi talked about this, and certainly Angela Davis before him. So it's not a new concept, but it's just, I think it's so important because it undergirds one of the main reasons why we seem to have all these initiatives and these DEI councils and people and chief diversity officers and throwing all this money. But when we look at the outcomes, we seem to almost be stuck in quicksand. And I think that the difference between those two concepts is one of the reasons why. And for me, the difference between the two is just action. Okay. Non-racist, for me, it's really just someone who's not actively doing something racist, someone who, holds egalitarian views, someone who believes in equality, someone who has a Black friend, or someone who might sit on the D&I council. So someone who doesn't view themselves as actively being part of the problem. But to me, a good analogy is almost like if you're driving down the street and you see a house on fire. Well, you didn't start the fire, okay? You didn't light the match. But if you just keep driving, you're not really doing anything. It doesn't help to have pity. It doesn't help to say, oh my God, I hope everybody's okay. So anti-racist is actually taking action. That is what makes a difference, okay? We need you to pick up a fire extinguisher. We need you to call 911. We need you to spit. We need you to do something to actually try to put out the fire. So for me, my personal definition of anti-racism, and I say this in one of my LinkedIn learning courses, really simple. It's actively working to fight racism. Okay. And I think that too often we get confused today because we think that, well, if I believe in equality and I voted for Obama and I have a sign in my yard and I hashtag Black Lives Matter, I'm as anti-racist as you can get. But the problem is all of those things are, kind of ornamental. They may make you feel good about your values, but if you're not really living your values, if you're not really speaking up in the meeting, if you're not suggesting that we revisit our supplier management criteria, if you're not challenging, you're not questioning, then you're really kind of just driving by that fire and saying, you know what, I'm going to pray for that family when I get home tonight. Okay. So for me, that's really the difference.
Right. Can you give us those examples again? So when you're saying that, and again, this is to clarify it for the audience, when you're saying to be active or become an anti-racist, what examples would that be? So you mentioned speaking up in a meeting. What are other examples? You know what? Let's help the audience in becoming an anti-racist. What would you tell the audience today in helping them to be an anti-racist is a better question.
Yeah, and as I answer that question, let me reflect back on a lot of what I saw people doing after George Floyd and Amy Cooper. There was a lot of energy around joining book clubs. And anybody who knows me on LinkedIn knows I am all about history and education. That is so important. I personally post a historical nugget about racism every single day, 7 days a week. So I think that's critically important. But the analogy I try to draw is losing weight. Okay. So if you're trying to lose weight, as many of us have at some point, in our life, reading the books and getting the education in many ways is a prerequisite. And I personally do think it is a prerequisite. You have to have a certain level of racial literacy, because if you don't, we simply can't even have a productive conversation. It's like, we're talking apples and oranges, because I think there's too much mythology out there. You need to learn history. So that needs to be done. But in terms of the action, if you kind of stop there and you kind of get stuck there, or you feel, you're patting yourself on the back, you're so excited about the fact that, I'm really in it. Like, I do this book club, like, religiously, like every single month. I haven't missed a month. Again, it's like, you're not going to lose any weight until you make behavioral change. So I can read the books all day long. I can read about what I'm supposed to do. But until I actually make some changes, I'm not going to see a real difference. So in terms of what are things that people can do, I do think that literacy component is very, very important. And I also don't want people to feel like, we're saying you got to read 1,000 books. I mean, we know you got kids, you got a job, you got all this other stuff going on. There's so many ways that you can enhance your racial literacy beyond reading, 500, 1,000-page book. So if you want more on that, Google, there are lots of resources, but I wrote 2 articles specifically about how you can enhance your racial literacy. But I say, look where you are. Too often we look at things that are going on globally or nationally, and we feel, there's nothing, that we can really do. But there is so much that you can do. Look around. Where are you seeing differences? What does your organization look like? How many Black and brown people do you see in senior level leadership? And let's make it even more local. What happens on your calls? Are there just 1 or 2 voices that are kind of dominating and you can tell are more influential? But then there are other people might be younger, might be Black and brown, might be women, might be LGBTQ, whatever it is, who don't seem to have as much influence or who don't seem to be listened to as much. Is there something that you could do to try to make a way for them? Is there a way that you could speak up against? Do you hear microaggressions in the hallways, in the break room? I mean, it's just around us so much. So the point is, figure out within your area, where are you seeing disparities? Where are you seeing racially disparate outcomes? And actively working to change those. I can give you a tiny example. I work in facilitation. I teach facilitation. I've done it for 20 years. When I had submitted to speak at a conference, and honestly, I had completely forgotten about it. And so they posted, I think on LinkedIn or something, their speakers. And when I saw the speakers that came out, it was like stark. Like I can't remember the exact numbers now, but I think it was they had something like 50 speakers, and I think only like one was non-white. And so I reached out to the organizers and I said, hey, I'm a little concerned about this lack of diversity. I'd like to talk to you about that. Now for me, I'm a speaker. I've been a professional speaker for 2 decades. I normally respond to these proposals. I know how the process works. So this was kind of my bailiwick. And I ended up having a conference, a meeting with them to talk through it. They were, gracious enough to participate in that meeting, and they admitted, they said, no, it shouldn't be this way. There's a problem. And so I really kind of pushed back on them. I wasn't going to just look at that and say, well, they got a problem and move on. So whatever it looks like, it's going to look different for different people. But the point is, are you speaking up? Are you doing something? I actually saw somebody on LinkedIn literally this morning who said the same thing, who said she spoke up in a meeting or pushed back about something. And then somebody sent her a private message later and said, oh, I really appreciate your saying something. And she was like, well, why didn't you say something in the meeting? Why didn't you back me up? So I think there are a million different ways we can really, really make a difference. And a lot of it is just by asking a question.
I think
it really is.
Sorry to interrupt. I think one of the things that is important when having those moments of aha, of, hey, instead of just hearing about it, let me just do something, is a lot of times, even in my experience, it starts with a conversation. And it starts with a conversation with somebody close to you. Because a lot of times people don't have the language or the confidence to talk about such topics because it was always seen as, hey, I'm not involved, or this doesn't concern me, or I'm not in the minority they're speaking of. And that's okay, but just starting that conversation and starting being like, why? And asking the question, why is it this way? Why can't we change it? Why did you select those people? And having those discussion and being confident in being able to speak about it, I think also opens up so many doors.
Sahara, I think you bring up great points. And that's something that, I addressed in the course a little bit. And that's why I think the language does matter. So let's say you're a white person and you're kind of wanting to support and you're wanting to chime in. I think it's great to say, Sahara, I don't want to speak for you, but I just wanted to throw this question out, or this is something that I noticed. I'm just wondering, is it a concern for anyone else? So there are lots of ways. I call them conversation crutches. There's some language and some that you can start to rely on that you can use over time. One of my best suggestions is turn it into a question. If you feel like you're a little nervous about it or it's uncomfortable for you, instead of making it a statement, and not to say you never want to make it a statement, because there are times when you certainly just want to make the statement, but just throw that in your bag of tricks. How can I turn this into a question and say, hey, I noticed on our lineup that it didn't seem to be terribly diverse. I'm just wondering, did anyone else have that concern? And so that can be so helpful, just throwing that question out there, and providing an opportunity for maybe even other people to chime in on it.
I think that's a really good thing. I think a lot of times people also want to be involved in that conversation, especially with senior leaders. They might not associate themselves with certain minorities, but they would still like to be included in that conversation to say, hey, I also want to be included in this table discussion of minorities because I have a voice. So having those questions, I think, are really helpful. One of my other things that I like to assert is, can you please help me clarify this? And then help them clarify it.
Yeah, and that's a great one, I think, for microaggressions as well. And I think, what you're doing is hitting the nail right on the head. Come up with those phrases that are really comfortable for you, particularly if you don't want to be as confrontational. But I think the key is it's not about how you say something necessarily, but just the fact that you do. And I think that's also another point. You don't have to do it the way somebody else does it. For me, I've always been more blunt. I've always been more candid. I've always been more assertive. That's my style. Doesn't mean the way you interact or the way you raise an issue has to look just like someone else. So you can do it in your own way. The key, going back to Rochelle's initial question, is anti-racism. It's just about, are you doing something?
Yes, I love that. I love that. I love that distinguish of, are you actually doing something? Are you taking action? What are the steps that you took instead of, hey, I have a black friend, or hey, I dated a black guy? Because I like I've called out people and they've told me this, and I'm like, that's not.
Okay, can I just say something on this? I'm sorry. Can I just say something on
Yes,
this?
Absolutely.
yes.
Okay, two points, and I'm afraid I'm going to lose my second point. I need to jot myself a note on the I have a black friend. Okay, I think that we're confusing and conflating decency with equity. Okay, and I'm actually getting ready to write an article that relates to this as well. Part of the problem is we're stuck thinking about what I call racism 1.0 or racism 2.0. To me, 1.0 was like pre-emancipation, and then 2.0 was like the Jim Crow era, and now we're kind of in 3.0 with mass incarceration, etc. So when there are too many white people in particular, but not exclusively, who want too many accolades for just being a decent person. Okay, we understand that you're not with the KKK, and you're not burning crosses on the weekends, and you have black kids over your house. Like, okay, yes, like we should have a higher bar in 2022 than that kind of stuff that we were dealing with in the 1920s. We know this is not the 1920s and the 1950s. That, from my perspective, is just decency. That's just being a decent person. So it's like parenting. Like, you don't get an award for feeding your children. Okay, you're supposed to feed your children. Okay, so now we're supposed to be decent to each other. We're supposed to believe in just fundamental equality. To me, those are just basics that we're supposed to have. So that's one issue. The other thing is, I just want to elevate something that Robin DiAngelo, a point that she made in one of her books, I thought was so powerful, about how proximity, just doesn't inoculate you. The way, if you look at sexism, every single person who's been sexist from the beginning of time has had a close relationship with a woman. Okay, everybody had a mother or a wife or a girlfriend or a daughter or a niece or something. So yeah, exactly. So just because you have a close relationship with someone of that group does not in any way inoculate you. And then one of the things that I've talked about, and I'm going to talk about in this next article, even me, I'm a black person, I still have racial biases. So it's not about you're being a good person. It's not about that. It's about I'm breathing the same air, drinking the same water you all are drinking. So it's like a pollution. I've grown up in a white supremacist society. So as a result of that, I've ingested a lot of that venom without realizing it. And it kind of goes back to the doll test back from the 50s. What was so powerful about the doll test, before they overturned for the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, wasn't just that it showed that the white kids had a preference for white over black. It showed that the black kids also had a preference for white over black. And that is what pushed them to see that separate was inherently unequal. So
Right.
thanks so much for that.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting. I'm going to share a personal story. I think I've already spoken about it on the podcast. So when you said that about the it wasn't an experiment, but to see,
The doll test.
how, right, to see how the children were absorbing the information or being whitewashed is what I call it. The I had brought my daughter to a Broadway, and she was 2, I believe, 2 or 3, 2 turning on to 3, and she said a few words, but there were certain things that she did that clearly made me understand how she was thinking. And so it was a whole bunch of puppies. And but obviously the puppies were human, so they had floppy ears and you could see their face. And in seeing all their faces, I was focusing on, the red dog and the yellow dog and looking at them wagging their tails. And then she would tap me on my shoulder because I told her she wasn't allowed to speak in the Broadway. So tap me on my shoulder and then she'd touch her skin. And I go, "Oh," I said, "you're looking at the red." For me, he was red, the red puppy. And then she shook her head. She goes, "No, mommy." And then she pointed to her face again. I had no clue what she was referring to. And because my process is a little longer. So I was processing the information. And then I realized, I said, okay, I'm going to experiment as a mom. And we come from all different shades of brown in my family. So I showed her a picture of a family member. And sure enough, she pointed to her skin and she said, "Not beautiful." And
Oh,
I said,
yeah.
"Well," I said, "Why do you feel that way?" And she said, "Mommy, no." And she just kept saying, "Mommy, no, mommy, no." So I realized that, the conversation had to begin. And from there, I left one county. Literally in less than a year, I left one county and moved to a very diverse community. I took her out of the school that she was at. She was at a private school, and I put her in a school where 50% of the population is Haitian or African American.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to get rid of all the white princess books.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? So I realized that it was so subtle.
Right.
And once she had addressed, or to me, that I had to, like you said, use now a language for her to be able to understand, to redefine herself so that she saw more representation, so she can, poof out her curly hair because she's got this long curly hair. Those little things were already defining all her own unconscious biases.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, and it's sad. Yeah.
It,
And Black women just relate. I mean, I grew up with my mom. Remember Halloween used to have those hard masks that you put on with the little rubber band? Okay.
Right.
Like I'm 51, so I know I'm older, but that's what we grew up with. So we had the little mask and you only had like 10 to choose from. Well, the princess, like all little girls want to be the princess. Well, guess what? The princess wasn't Black. Okay. Nope. There was no Meghan Markle, the princess was white that was just the way it was. So my mom would have to buy the princess, and then she would put makeup on it. She put makeup all over it to make it look, and that's actually, I was talking to somebody about privilege the other day. And I know that's like a whole nother topic, but that's just a great example of what we mean when we say privilege. Like white people, they just got to show up. They got to go to school. They got to, everything was, designed with them as the default. Versus I remember my mother making a petition to get a Black Santa in the mall. Okay. I remember coming home with lists of famous people or important people, and there not being one Black person on the list for me to read about and write a project about. So my mom would scratch, and my mom would say, okay, here are 5 more names I'm going to add to the list. Okay. She's going to pick from these people. So it's about that you just have a completely different experience. We had a similar issue in our house because my son is really, really light. And so I struggled a little bit with his identity, for one thing, but you just want them to have that pride. You don't want them to feel less than. And we just know that unfortunately, we grow up in a society that sends that message, whether it's overt or it's subliminal, that white is good, white is smart, white is success, and Black is kind of the opposite. And if you have any question about that, just look up in a thesaurus. I know I sound like 100 now, but just look up online synonyms for Black and white. Just
Right.
look them up. Look, what does Black mean and what does white mean? And I think that's just a perfect, really, really simple way to show the values that our society has placed on Blackness and whiteness. And so unfortunately for Black parents in particular, and I would say not just for us, for it really should be everybody, because everyone should want equity. We have to do that much more to try to ensure that our kids have that sense of confidence and worth.
Absolutely.
One thing I do want to add in is that also being present for other people's diversity. That's one of the things that I've learned is that I'm obviously a brown girl. I have curly hair. I tan really well, but I can also go at the other spectrum of straightening my hair and being super, fair skin in the wintertime, where I'm also almost passing as white, right? So it's very apparent to me when people are having certain conversations with me based on what I look like. And I had to take a step back and really understand what that means and really speak up, like you said, from being like, oh, I'm not racist to I'm anti-racist, as to, okay, but am I not only stepping up for me, but am I stepping up for others as well? Am I stepping up for the Black community? Am I stepping up for the Asian community? Am I stepping up for the trans community? People that might not be in the spaces or the tables that I'm at or I'm privileged to be at, and making sure that their voices are also elevated, even if they're not there or they're not present. And I think that's something that was important to me, and I wanted to talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. There's she's often, thank you so much to the audience. We have a lot of comments and a lot
Yes.
of
Shout out to all my peeps on here. I see a lot of people, Kristen, Joe, a lot of my peeps are on here, so thanks.
yeah, Marcello, Joe Flack, like London Calling, and Sharon Armstead. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Thank you so much for joining. And she said something interesting here. She said, my daughter was 5 when on a beach in Virginia, and a man refused to let his white daughter play with the little N. She asked me the meaning, but then refused the play with the Black girls on the beach. She was banned from white dolls then, and I did the same with my granddaughter.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I literally remember when we were moving into a white neighborhood and they had to have a meeting about us moving in. And I think this is also a good example of when people say, well, the laws are changed, so what's the problem? The laws are changed. Yes, legally, we could live there. But at the same time, from a parent's perspective, do they want to move us into this house with a first Black family and then we're going to get harassed and, they're going to be burning crosses or, whatever it's going to be, because clearly there was a ton of hostility about us moving in. So can you imagine, this is again another example of privilege, because I don't think white parents have this conversation. Can you imagine explaining to your children that we can't move in yet because they have to have a meeting to figure out if they're okay, if they're going to be nonviolent, having a Black family move in. And the reason why Sharon's, story reminded me, I had not heard the N-word before, but right after we moved in, like our ball went into the next door neighbor's yard. And so when we went to get the ball, the little kids were out there. And so they asked us, like, are you all the niggers? And so we didn't know what it was. And so we went home and asked our parents, are we the niggers? So again, it's like this stuff for a lot of people sounds so anachronistic. It sounds like 300 years ago, but it's not. This is my childhood. This is what I experienced. Very common, not to mention what my mother, and her entire family experienced. So, these are, it's just part of the reality of our society. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why we talk about the uncomfortable conversations. Well, guess what about the uncomfortable experiences? The reason why the conversation is uncomfortable was because the reality was so horrific.
Mm-hmm.
So, so it's like now we're running through this issue of, not wanting your kids to be disturbed about having to read about it. Well, what about our kids who had to experience it? Right. So at any rate, there's a lot of, real serious stuff out there.
Mm. So when we talk about anti-racism, and I think that's something else that we probably need to address, what is race?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important point, because many of us, I'm sure, have heard that race is a social construct, but we may not understand exactly what that means. So race, a lot of times, unfortunately, we buy into this mythology that, oh yeah, anytime you have different races, you're going to have, issues with equity, equality. No, race is the child of racism, not the parent. Okay. So it means that once they decided that they were going to have slavery and have a system of subjugation, they had to create a social infrastructure to continue to enforce that. They didn't start with Africans. Anybody who knows history knows they didn't just start with Africa. They tried other things first. They tried the indentured servants from Britain. They tried Indians. But part of the problem was it was too hard to distinguish who's a master and, who has power, who doesn't have power, who's a master, who's a servant. So part of the uniqueness, the reason why Africans were uniquely suited in their view was there was a stark color difference. So they could automatically determine just based on color who's the slave and who's the owner. And so that system, that categorization, that way to differentiate was something that was completely concocted to try to support that underlying system of economic and other social subjugation, because of course, when white people came over, they didn't call themselves white. They called themselves British or French or German or Irish. They were wherever they came from. They didn't, at home, when they were in Ireland, they didn't call themselves white. So that was something that was completely new that was created. In fact, Isabel Wilkerson, in her wonderful work, Caste, highly recommended if you haven't read it.
Oh, I did.
For anybody who's out there. She talks about giving a talk and having an African woman coming up to her afterwards saying, well, in Africa, there are no Black people. And she said, at first she was a little like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, that's a Western concept. Like in Africa, we don't call ourselves Black. You're Nigerian, you're Somalian, you're Ghanaian. There is no Black. Black was just this categorization that was completely concocted, completely created to support the underlying system of oppression
and the subordination.
Right. And then, of course, they created a narrative that went along with that, because the other thing is they wanted to feel good about themselves. Okay, I don't want to feel like I'm a criminal, I'm a rapist, I'm a murderer, I'm a kidnapper, I'm all these things. So we're going to create this narrative and this mythology around racial inferiority. So that was also why race was created. And that honestly was what was so detrimental and what followed long after the laws were changed, because that's why Brian Stevenson famously says the North won the Civil War but the South won the Cultural War. That's why we continue to struggle, because if the problem was just the laws, then as soon as the laws were changed, everything would have been a lot better. But the problem was there was this narrative that was created along with the laws that, Black people are just inferior. They need us to guide them. They can't do it on their own. They're criminals. They're not as smart. They're sexually promiscuous. So that narrative is what continued and continues to this day. And so that's why in 2022, we continue to have a lot of the same problems that we've struggled with for centuries.
I think one of the conversations that I used to have or I had with my previous manager at L'Oreal, about race and what was going on, what was happening, and she said something very aggressive to me that I was like, oh my god. First of all, she said that, oh, I can't be racist because I had brown and Black friends growing up. So that to me was already a red flag. And then the second thing she said was that a person clearly of the Caucasian background. And she said that, because I brought up the fact that, hey, we don't have any women or people of color in our leadership. And it's very clear. And she said, that's not a fact. So and so, that's a person of color. And I looked at her and I'm like, that's a Caucasian woman. So like, so, and I'm here like a brown person, a person of color, and you're telling me that like a Caucasian woman is not who she is. I'm like, how do you define culture? How are you defining Caucasianness? How are you defining what's brown or Black or Asian? Like that's also so undefined, or like you said, like it's just created in their minds. Like there is no value behind it.
Yeah. Well, also I think that biologically, genetically, we're all mostly the same. I think we're 99%, genetically very similar. And obviously, like I've done my what is it, ancestry.com. My husband's really into that. So, I know my breakdown, I think is 75-25. Ironically, it's funny you say that. My husband is actually 56% Caucasian. And then the balance is African. So when we talk about race, you can talk about it from lots of different perspectives. And that's why how you identify is also so important. It's like, it's not for me to say how, but it's really for that other person to say. But I think that in this country, how you present and how you are perceived is oftentimes what dominates. So, in terms of what that actual DNA says or what ancestry says, that might be one thing, but how do you present and how are you perceived? And of course, because of our racial history, we have that perception. It's like the one drop rule. Like, if it's either Black or white, it's kind of binary. It's very binary versus like I traveled to South Africa actually back during apartheid. And the system that they had there was very different. And even how I was perceived was very different. They perceived me as colored because I didn't appear to them to be like 100% African. So they had a 4-tiered system. They had African, colored, Indian, and white. And of course, they stratified to divide and conquer. And so that's how, minority was able to rule. But I think you're raising just really, really important issues, that it's a really complicated topic.
And I think also within the race, because I know in a lot of countries, I'm Haitian, my parents are both Haitian, and I think also in a lot of Caribbean countries and Latin American countries, there's also within all
The
of that.
colorism.
Yeah.
Yeah, colorism,
Yeah.
texturism. I mean, it goes really deep. And that's one of the reasons why it's not just white people
That's
who
it.
can, be racially biased. Black
Right.
people can have some of those biases as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah.
No, go ahead. Absolutely.
No, I just know that, colorism is a huge, it's a very, very big issue in terms of, so for those who aren't familiar, within a particular racial group, there can also be this element of colorism. And it's not just Black people. I think in India, South Asia, they've struggled with that as well, where darker, it's better to be lighter.
Right.
Let it out that way. It's better to be lighter. So it always goes back to whiteness is better and blackness
Right.
is bad. And
Right.
so unfortunately, actually, it's funny you say that. I think I even saw on CNN, there was a link to an article on CNN that talked about racism within her own family.
Right.
And that happens sometimes. So
Right.
it's really, really deep and multi-layered.
It is. I know. I read an article, and I think I presented it on another podcast where I think according to the World Health Organization, lightning creams are a $540 billion industry in India alone.
My mother has friends in South Africa, and when her friend came to the US, God, it was probably about 10 years ago, she wanted to buy lightning cream. That was that was like the main thing that she wanted to get. Denise just said in the comments, my passport was stamped honorary white when she went to South Africa in 1992.
Wow.
So it's very deep. I mean, very, very deep.
Well, that's speaking of that, that's the culture that I grew up with. I was born in Pakistan, and my dad is from India. So I grew up knowing that, knowing and learning about the partition between India and Pakistan after the British left. So I'm very well versed in my history and culture. And then again, talking about the lightning creams, I grew up with Fair and Lovely. That was just the cream that everyone used, and there was Fair and Lovely for men. So that was, again, fair is better, dark is not good. And I think when speaking of racism within your own family, like I've had these difficult conversations with my own parents about when moving to Canada or moving to the US about, Black people being like aggressive or bad or seen as that because that's what we grew up with. However, like I had good friends that were like Black, and I'm like, but they're not like that. And me just saying, but at a young age, that the value or what the culture shows us is not true. And learning that there are so many different spectrum of people. And even in India, I think there's still a caste system.
There is.
Whereas, yes, if you are darker, you're seen as, the farmer or the worker. And if you're lighter, you're seen as, the landowner or kind of the business owner now. So it's very much present, and I've had to have these tough conversations with my own parents, and unfortunately sometimes they're still stuck in their old ways, and you have to understand that's also okay, but you want to break that cycle and you want to have these conversations now, so moving forward you know what to say and how to say it to your kids and your nieces and nephew, and also to other people based on that.
Right. It's interesting. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
There's a book based on what Sahar was saying, Our Kind of People, and by Lawrence Graham. He passed away. And in exactly the first couple of chapters, the first chapter actually, he mentions, when Africans came to the United States in 1400s, they had already subjugated, them to being in a caste, and then they divided them by color. So exactly what Sahar was saying. So they were field N, and then there was the house N.
House people, yeah.
And then the field N were outside working in the sun, doing the field work. And
Right.
then, right. And then the house ends were the fairer skinned. They got some education or a lot of education by their masters. I mean, there were so many other things that happened to the women. The women were raped and sexually abused. But like we were saying, there's so many. It's going to have to take another podcast. There's so many other layers that's
Oh yeah.
involving all of the like you said, the colorism within the racism, the texturism, and those simple comments like, oh, how come you speak so well, those. And I think what makes it more difficult is that it's everywhere around us. It's in the media, it's in commercials, it's on the news, it's in my daughter's books. When I go to the pediatrician, finally we found a an African American dentist, which it was very difficult time finding, and an African American pediatrician. And when those shifts happened for her, she was able to better see how she could be represented. And I think also that's the crux of it all. And when you think of those, the opportunities are there, and we have so much education to level up just to be at the same level as everybody else, that we have to constantly prove ourselves and have a master's and we have a PhD and we have a certification and we have a course and we have a this and we have all these experiences
Yep.
just to be able to get our foot inside the door.
Right.
Right. So when you think of,
Absolutely.
right, it's not what's being portrayed in the media. In the media, we're being portrayed as criminals. In the media, we're being portrayed as super poor, third world country this, third world country that. My daughter's books at school, she had no idea Africa had houses, because in the books, they're all huts.
Right. And the media, it makes a huge difference. I mean, if you just consume what is coming out of the media, it kind of makes sense. It's like, oh my gosh, look at these projects and
Yeah.
crack, and people getting arrested left and right. And I can't remember whose book I was reading, but they actually showed the statistics to show how Black criminals are very often overrepresented in the media. So the actual statistics in terms of the committing the crimes,
Right.
Was fairly equal. Like in terms of drug users, was pretty equal. But in terms of who actually gets incarcerated, and then who is presented in the media as criminals, there oftentimes is that Black overrepresentation. And so that creates it continues that narrative. I see that Deb asked the question, can you elaborate on the comment, the North won the war, but the South won the culture war? So that was Brian Stevenson's comment. He was like, the North won the actual war, but the South won the cultural war, meaning even though technically the North won, and so slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, except for its punishment for a crime. So that's a whole, another issue, because it really continued. But that, because that narrative of racial difference and racial inferiority, because that narrative persisted, they continued to oppress. So that's why we had lynchings. That's why we had Jim Crow for 100 years. I mean, think about it. Black men, let me be clear, Black men were granted the right to vote by the 15th Amendment, and it was 1868. But that didn't really happen. That wasn't really realized until the Voting Rights Act 1965. So it's like 100 years. So what was happening in that 100 years? That's when they came up with the literacy test and the polls, all of these things that we're seeing to start to resurface now to remove the right to vote or to prevent them from voting. And also violence. I mean, that was a huge one. So that's really what I'm meaning there. It's like, technically, yes, they won the war, but Black people continue to be oppressed. And so that narrative persisted. And also the South won in so many ways in terms of, of course, the troops got pulled in 1877. And so that's why it was just rampant. They were able to just rampantly lynch Black people, create this society where, there's overt racial subjugation. And also just looking at the statues, all those statues came up, in celebration of the history of the Confederacy, all of that. So there's this celebration, and that's something that's uniquely American. I mean, I was in Berlin probably 8 years ago, and we were on a tour, and they specifically said, oh yeah, this is where Hitler died, but there's like an apartment complex there in a parking lot. They were like, we don't put any markers whatsoever, because we don't want any celebration of that. We know that racism is still alive and well. We don't want racists coming and congregating and celebrating him. We don't want any of that. So the way they handled their racist past and the way we handled it just completely differently. When they took us to the cemetery, they said, this is the cemetery of the murdered Jews. And I was like, oh my God, wait, but that said so much. They weren't trying to put lipstick on a pig and make it seem like it wasn't that bad. They, it seemed like they knew the best way to move past it is to acknowledge it. Let's not try to pretend it wasn't that bad. It was horrific. So, that's what I mean by that statement.
One of the things that I struggle with as a Canadian is saying that we have it better than the US does. There's a lot of aggression, but a lot of people don't realize is that our Indigenous and our people of color still are subject to a lot of these issues. And there are still laws that are currently being passed that are further pushing this white supremacist narrative. Or even in Quebec, there was laws specifically passed to for minorities or for immigrants that you have to learn French within the first 6 months. Or there was another law being passed that you cannot wear a hijab and if you work for a public anything. So a teacher that wore a hijab all of her career had to take it off or leave her job because that was not allowed anymore. So there's like little insidious policies that are being pushed that are also like, what we're talking about, further there to divide instead of, pushing for diversity and bringing everyone together and more inclusion.
So why do you think it should be everybody's business? Going back to our initial topic, why should anti-racism be everybody's business and then not left to the DEI council or,
right.
the DEI specific organization?
Right. Well, that's a big question. And I know we got off on so many other topics, but I really enjoyed the conversation. I know we're running out of time, but this is my view. Like I said, I've been a corporate trainer for 20 years. I'm a Black female. So over the years, I got tons of requests to do diversity stuff. I always was like, oh, no, I don't do that. That's not me. In my mind, DEI, that was like an HR thing. HR does that. I don't, really do that. So then something really changed for me after George Floyd, Amy Cooper, like a lot of people. I really dug in and I said, I've got to do something. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I've got to do something. And so literally, because I write, I'm a contributor with Forbes, I just started writing a lot of articles that align with my expertise. So I have expertise about meeting facilitation and managing up and project management, things like that. So I wrote articles. And then the more I leaned into this and I studied a ton, I read like 75 books. So I studied a ton and I started developing and curating some specific material. And I just started realizing, I was like, this is why we've made so little progress. Because when I saw George Floyd, all I thought about was Rodney King. That's all I could think about. And it was literally 29 years from Rodney King to George Floyd. And I'm like, gosh, all this time has passed. we have all these DEI councils and DEI initiatives. Like DEI isn't new. I mean, it's been around for decades. I'm like, why is it we've made so little progress while we've had all this stuff? And certainly in corporate America, they've had all this stuff for decades. And so it was kind of a light bulb moment for me. I realized, I was like, that's the problem. I said, because we view it as just this little thing that we can, pull out in February and do a little, lunch and learn and eat something ethnic that we consider ethnic because it's not white. Yes.
Right.
And put it away and we're done with it. I was like, that's the problem. We can't leave it to this one particular group that usually is under-resourced, underappreciated, oftentimes does not have the same level of influence, isn't reporting into the CEO. The problem is every single person in the organization needs to dig in and figure out how I need to make a difference. The other issue is oftentimes people who would be like DEI come out of the HR space, and they weren't necessarily in the specific lines of business. They weren't necessarily doing the sales work, the marketing work, the research and development, the product development. You need people who are in those jobs. They see the disparities, they see the problems. So if you're, in a hospital situation, the nurses, the doctors, my husband's a physician. So he tells me about things that only he can see from the perspective of a clinical provider. Just like I was on a panel one time with a guy who was a lawyer. He quit law and because he saw so much discrimination and developed and went into equity work full time. But he was like, but had I not practiced law for 15 years, I wouldn't have known that. And he was like, now somebody who's in HR or someone who is a DEI person might be well-intentioned, but they didn't practice law for 20 years. So they're not in the operating room. They're not actually seeing how it's showing up or what some of the problems are. So it's not to disparage DEI or that work, because I think it's really important work. And oftentimes they're overburdened. They're trying to do too much. They're trying to talk about anti-racism. They're trying to look at gender identity and sexual orientation and age and neurodiversity and just all these different things. But really, if we're going to move the needle in terms of anti-racism, it's got to be everybody's business. So if I'm a corporate trainer, I'm training on meeting facilitation and project management, and I'm training leaders, I need to be thinking through an anti-racism lens. Like in the work that I'm doing, how can I advance anti-racism? So if you're in supplier management, if you're an accountant, if you're an attorney, whatever you're doing, wherever you are, because racism shows up everywhere. Yep. Racism isn't just showing up at the DEI meetings, okay? It's showing up everywhere. And if we really want to move the needle and if we really want to make a difference, everybody has got to get involved.
Absolutely. And I think also that's where that's like you said, it's the only way that the needle can be pushed forward. Everyone has to get involved. And I think also when it comes to DEI, it's very, you see someone said, I have a friend that is an ER doctor and some patients refuse to be seen by him. It's, very, we have lived experiences. And I know we don't have much time, but, again, when George Floyd was murdered, it was very, very traumatic for everybody. And then when I think of how it impacted me, now I had to relive and remember, because I'm also Canadian. I live in South Florida now, but I'm also Canadian. All the racism that I had suffered, and then I had to come to terms with all those memories. Mm-hmm. So it was impactful. I had to come to terms and deal with emotions and anger and sadness and despair. And, and like you, Dana and Seher, it was, how can I make a difference? Because I'm 50. I have all these years of living in a system that has, seen me as inferior or not accepting, and as a woman, that it's something that we need to come to terms with. But like you said, we need to take action.
Mm.
And when we take action, that's when we're creating our own purpose. And because we have that purpose, then the DEI needle is being pushed a little bit forward. What would your parting words be for us, Dana?
Yeah, I would say the good news is, because sometimes we can feel
I
overwhelmed. The
know.
good news is you really can make a difference. I would say
Right.
start small. And one of my favorite quotes is Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. So don't try to think you have to do everything. And it can be exhausting work. So, pick and choose, but you absolutely can make a difference.
Yes, love that. Thank you, Dana. I had a lovely conversation. This was amazing. Thank you, Rochelle, for another great podcast.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure as we're reaching the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour. Thank you all for today. I'm sorry we weren't able to reach all your comments, but I will reach out to you. Thank you again. Please reach out to us if you have any questions on LinkedIn. We hope to see you usually on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, where we started airing every other week. Please keep in touch and we stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all. Thank
Thank you.
you.